In December 1941, in the tense days following Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the empire's highest-ranking generals and admirals gathered in Tokyo to chart the next phase of their war. Confidence ran high. Victories across the Pacific had emboldened the imperial leadership, and many believed the momentum could carry Japan even further to the very shores of the American mainland. Yet amid the excitement and pride, one man stood apart. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, carried a grim expression as he faced the War Council. Having spent years in the United States as a naval attaché and student, he knew America more intimately than anyone in that room. What he had seen there, what he had learned about the American people filled him not with confidence, but with dread. While others imagined glorious conquest, Yamamoto saw an insurmountable reality. He warned that Japan had made a terrible miscalculation. The threat America posed, he said, was not confined to its warships, its soldiers, or its vast industrial power. It was something much deeper, something woven into the very character of the nation itself. The room grew still as Yamamoto placed a leather folder on the polished table before him. Inside lay photographs, intelligence reports, and handwritten notes gathered during his years abroad. He began describing his travels across the United States, from bustling cities like Chicago and New York to small rural towns scattered across the plains. Everywhere he went, he noticed a strange and consistent pattern. American homes were unlike any others in the world. They were not grand palaces or monuments of wealth, but they contained something far more formidable. In nearly every community, hardware stores stood packed with tools and ammunition. Gun shops lined busy main streets. Even small-town sporting goods stores displayed rifles and shotguns in their windows as casually as Japan displayed kimonos or pottery. In Japan, Yamamoto explained, only soldiers possess rifles. But in America, everyone has rifles. The generals exchanged uneasy glances. To them, it sounded like a trivial observation. What difference could civilian firearms possibly make against the disciplined might of the Imperial Army? Yamamoto answered not with words, but with numbers. Spreading a sheet of intelligence data across the table, he revealed a statistic that sent a chill through the room. America, with a population of about 130 million, was believed to have more than 100 million privately owned firearms, nearly one for every man, woman, and child. These were not ornamental weapons, he explained, but tools of daily life. American boys learned to shoot before they learned to drive. Fathers took sons hunting in the woods. Mothers taught daughters to handle rifles safely and accurately. Marksmanship was as natural as reading or farming. Every farmhouse is a potential fortress, Yamamoto said in a low, measured tone. Every small town, a battlefield. The officers stirred uneasily, their confidence fading. One general tried to object, insisting that civilian hunters could not stand against professional soldiers. Yamamoto's reply was quiet but devastating. Many of these civilians, he said, had the accuracy of trained snipers. They hunted deer through dense forests, elk across open plains, even bears in the mountains. Their aim was instinctive, their patience endless. Against such defenders, any invading force would bleed for every inch of ground. Then, Yamamoto delivered his final revelation, the one that shattered any illusion of victory. He pulled out a massive map of the United States and unfurled it across the table. The sheer scale stunned the room into silence. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, the nation stretched nearly 3,000 miles, a land of vast mountains, dense forests, deserts, swamps, and sprawling plains. Look at it, he said quietly. Even if we land on their shores, where would we go? How far could we advance before we vanish into this endless land? Every road, every field, every ridge could hide resistance. The terrain itself was an enemy. Supply lines would stretch to breaking, communication would collapse, and any invasion force would be swallowed whole by the immensity of the continent. It would not be war, Yamamoto concluded grimly. It would be suicide. As his words sank in, the officers in the room understood what he meant. Japan might command courage and discipline, but America possessed something far more enduring: the fierce independence of a people who would fight for every home, every family, every patch of ground. Yamamoto's warning was clear and absolute. Japan could win battles, but it could never conquer the spirit of the United States. Long before the war reached its peak, he already knew the truth: Japan had lost, not to the weapons of America, but to the unbreakable will of its armed citizens. Even if Japan somehow succeeded in landing troops along the American West Coast, Admiral Yamamoto warned, their true struggle would only just begin. The vast continent before them was unlike any battleground they had ever faced. To advance inland, the invading forces would need to fight through the towering Rocky Mountains, across endless plains, and into terrain so vast and varied that it would swallow entire divisions. Every valley, every forest, and every farmhouse would become a fortress. Yamamoto described it vividly before the War Council: armed civilians concealed behind trees, rifles trained from every barn window, and determined defenders in every small town across the countryside. He asked them to imagine advancing mile by mile through a land where every citizen was a potential soldier, and every direction led into hostile ground. One general interrupted, confident that Japan's mighty navy could overcome such obstacles. Surely, he argued, the fleet could supply and reinforce any invasion force from the sea. Yamamoto shook his head, his voice calm but unyielding. The Pacific Ocean, he explained, was no simple barrier, it was a death trap. The supply lines would stretch across thousands of miles of open water, constantly threatened by American submarines and aircraft. Every bullet, every grain of rice, he said, would have to cross that ocean. Meanwhile, the Americans would be fighting on their home soil, their industries untouched, their people united, their supply lines measured not in oceans, but in minutes. For Japan, every shipment would be a gamble. For America, every factory would be an arsenal. Their factories can make tanks faster than we can ship rice, Yamamoto stated grimly. Those words hung heavy in the air. America's industrial capacity, he continued, was more terrifying than any weapon. While Japan struggled to replace a handful of lost aircraft each month, American assembly lines were producing hundreds. Automobile plants were being converted into tank factories, and shipyards launched new destroyers and carriers every single week. It was a machine of war unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed, a nation whose economy could outbuild entire empires. Every day that passed would strengthen America, while Japan would grow weaker, more desperate, more cornered. Yet, Yamamoto said, this was not the worst of it. The true danger lay not in the material power of the United States, but in the spirit of its people. Having lived among Americans, Yamamoto understood them in a way few Japanese officers could. He recalled their history, the Revolutionary War that saw farmers and blacksmiths rise against the world's greatest empire. These were not subjects of a monarch or worshippers of an emperor. They were citizens, free men and women who believed in independence above all else. You must understand, he said softly, professional army retreats when ordered, but armed civilians defending their homes do not retreat. They fight until there is nothing left to defend. He paused before adding the line that froze the room. You cannot negotiate with 100 million armed people. There is no surrender point. Japanese military doctrine was built on the belief that a nation could be broken if its army or its capital fell. Conquer the government, crush the morale, and victory would follow. But Yamamoto's voice cut through that illusion. America, he explained, had no single center to destroy. Capture Washington, D.C., and the states would still fight. Defeat their army, and millions of citizens would take up rifles to replace them. The war would never end. It would spread, grow, and consume everything until Japan itself was exhausted. It would be a war without victory, he warned. A struggle with no peace to follow. Finally, the generals demanded his judgment, pressing him for a simple answer. Could Japan ever invade the United States successfully? Yamamoto looked around the table at the faces of men who had conquered half of Asia, brilliant strategists who believed in destiny and discipline. His eyes were tired, but resolute. I fear, he said slowly, that all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant. The silence that followed was absolute. Those words would echo through history, as prophetic as they were tragic. Yamamoto understood what his comrades could not. The attack on Pearl Harbor had not crippled America. It had done the opposite. It had united a divided nation, focused its fury, and unleashed an industrial colossus fueled by vengeance and purpose. Japan had struck the first blow, but in doing so, it had sealed its own fate. The giant had awoken, and the world would soon feel its power. Invading the American homeland, Yamamoto warned, would be nothing short of suicide, not merely because of the U.S. military's strength, but because of something far deeper, something ingrained in the very spirit of the American people. He spoke of a force that could not be measured in divisions or fleets of fierce independence, a stubborn defiance that would transform every home into a fortress. To march against such a nation, he said, would be to wage war not just against soldiers, but against an entire people united in purpose. His words, dismissed by some as excessive caution, would later prove prophetic in ways even he could not have imagined. Japan never attempted a mainland invasion of the United States. The planners in Tokyo knew it was impossible, even in their most ambitious dreams. The Pacific Ocean was a chasm too wide to cross with supply lines intact and morale unbroken. Every calculation, every simulation ended in the same conclusion: disaster. The few times Japanese forces did set foot on American soil, most notably during the Aleutian Islands campaign in Alaska, the result confirmed Yamamoto's fears. Those barren, frozen islands, lashed by Arctic winds and shrouded in fog, had no great cities, no civilian militias, no industrial bases. And yet, even there, Japan could not hold its ground. American forces struck back with relentless precision, reclaiming the territory and proving that if Japan could not defend a handful of desolate rocks, it could never hope to occupy a continent. As the war raged across the Pacific, the American homeland transformed. Across every state, ordinary citizens, farmers, teachers, mechanics, and mothers volunteered for local defense units. Town halls became training centers, and community drills became weekly rituals. Even though no invasion ever came, the will to resist was palpable. Yamamoto's warnings had taken root in the American consciousness. Posters urging readiness hung in every shop and post office, and blackouts were practiced in coastal towns. The idea of invasion no longer terrified Americans. It steeled them. They would not flee. They would fight. When Yamamoto's plane was ambushed and shot down over Bougainville in 1943, the man who had once warned of the sleeping giant met the very fate he had feared for his nation: swift, decisive, and absolute. But his words lived on, echoing in speeches, military manuals, and the memories of those who studied his strategy. His message had been unmistakable. Behind every blade of grass, there would be a rifle. Behind every window, a defender. It was not hyperbole. The United States, with millions of gun-owning citizens and a deeply rooted culture of self-reliance, embodied the kind of resistance that could never be subdued by force. Combined with its vast geography and unparalleled industrial might, invasion became more than unthinkable, it became strategically impossible. By the war's end, even Japan's most hardened generals came to acknowledge what Yamamoto had always understood: America could never be conquered by force. Not in 1945, not in any foreseeable age. The industrial gap alone was insurmountable. For every aircraft Japan lost, America built 10. For every ship sunk, a dozen more slid down the ways of its shipyards. But beyond production numbers lay something even more formidable: the will of a nation unified by a single purpose. Every defeat only made the Americans more determined. Every loss strengthened their resolve. Decades later, historians would continue to invoke Yamamoto's hauntingly accurate warning about awakening a sleeping giant. His foresight became a symbol of tragic wisdom, a general who understood his enemy too well to save his own nation from its fate. The Japanese High Command's dread of an Allied invasion culminated in the Ketsugo Defense Plan, an act of desperation that bordered on madness. It envisioned every man, woman, and child in Japan taking up arms: bamboo spears against rifles, suicide pilots against fleets of bombers. Every city, every beach, Every mountain was to become a battlefield. Yet beneath this plan was an unspoken truth. It was a national death sentence. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the illusion of victory shattered completely. The emperor's decision to surrender was not simply an act of mercy, it was an act of survival. Japan's leaders finally faced what Yamamoto had foreseen years earlier, that to fight the United States to the end would mean extinction. His prophecy was fulfilled in full. Sometimes the greatest act of strategy is not in knowing how to win a war, but in recognizing when the war has already been lost. And for Japan, that realization came too late.